I can't do this. I don't want to marry you.
You must marry me.
No, please.
You must.
He kidnapped her, forced her into a wedding dress, made her say vows through clenched teeth and burning tears. And then, he had the audacity to fall so deeply, so completely, so desperately in love with her that he would burn down everything he had built just to keep her safe. This is not a soft story. This is not a gentle love. This is obsession wrapped in hatred. Hatred wrapped in power, and power cracked open by a woman who refused, absolutely refused to be broken. Stay with me until the very end of the story, because what happens in the final act will leave you speechless. And if you have never watched a video on this channel before, welcome to Korean Boss Stories. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I want to know. Now let's get into it. My name is Alicia Brown. And before all of this happened, before the penthouse, before the mafia, before the forced vows and the gunfire and the impossible feelings I never asked for, I was just a girl from Harlem trying to save the world one at-risk kid at a time. I was 28 years old. I had curly hair that I wore like a crown, warm brown skin that my grandmother always said was kissed by the sun, and eyes that people said looked like they had already seen too much. They weren't wrong. I lost my parents when I was a teenager. A drive-by shooting. Senseless. Random. The kind of violence that swallows whole families and leaves children behind to either drown or swim harder than anyone should have to. I chose to swim. I built a non-profit called Second Chance Streets. Out of nothing. Out of grief and love and the stubborn belief that the kids in my neighborhood deserved better than what the world kept offering them. My days were fueled by bad office coffee and grant applications and long conversations with teenagers who just needed someone to look them in the eye and say, I see you. I believe in you. You are not your circumstances. My evenings were spent volunteering at shelters. My nights were quiet, sometimes lonely, but mine. My life was not glamorous, but it was good. It was real. And it was enough. Until the day I crossed paths with you, June. I need you to understand who June was before I tell you how we met, because if you don't understand him, none of what happened next will make sense. June was 32 years old. He was the undisputed king of the Korean Mafia's American operations, a criminal empire known as the Claw Syndicate. Born in Seoul, raised in the brutal streets of Los Angeles after his family fled political persecution, he had clawed, and I mean that word literally, clawed his way to the top of the criminal underworld through a combination of ruthless intelligence and breathtaking cruelty. He was sharp-featured, high cheekbones, piercing dark eyes that missed nothing, a jawline that looked like it had been carved from stone. His arms were covered in tattoos of ancient Korean dragons, coiling and fierce, symbols of the control he had over everyone and everything around him. He ran casinos, smuggling rings, underground fight clubs across the entire East Coast. He had law enforcement in his pocket, politicians on speed dial, and an empire worth more money than most countries see in a decade. And he hated outsiders. Particularly, he hated Black Americans. Not because he was born with that hatred, but because someone had planted it in him like a seed in poisoned soil, and he had watered it with every year of pain that followed. When he was young, a Black American informant had sold out his father's operation to the feds. The raid that followed left June orphaned, alone, and seething with a rage that never fully cooled. He took that one act of betrayal and turned it into a lens through which he viewed an entire group of people. It was wrong. It was ugly. But it was his armor. And armor, no matter how wrong, protects something underneath. I just didn't know that yet. We met over a parking spot. I know how that sounds. But hear me out. It was a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that had already asked too much of me, 3 back-to-back meetings with city officials who couldn't care less about my kids, a funding deadline I was barely going to make, and a van full of supplies for a youth event that I desperately needed to unload. I pulled up to the reserved delivery spot outside my office building, and it was taken, occupied by a gleaming, immaculate black Mercedes that cost more money than my entire nonprofit's annual budget. I stood there for a moment. I looked at the car. I looked at the spot clearly marked for community deliveries. And something in me, the part that had been fighting invisible battles all day, all year, my whole life, just snapped. He stepped out of that car with the energy of a man who had never once been told no. Tall, cold, flanked by a row of suited men who looked like they had been manufactured specifically to intimidate. He barely glanced at me. "Move along, girl," he said, in a tone that made the word girl sound like something he had scraped off the bottom of his shoe. "This city belongs to those who take what they want." I should have walked away. I know that now. But I was exhausted and I was angry and I was tired of being dismissed. And in one moment of absolutely terrible judgment, I took my keys and I dragged them along the door of his precious Mercedes. One thin scratch. That was all it was. But in June's world, that scratch was a declaration of war. He didn't confront me again that day. He didn't need to. Instead, he did something far more calculated. He had me investigated. Within 48 hours, he knew everything about me. My nonprofit, my funding sources, my history, my vulnerabilities, and he began to dismantle me quietly, the way powerful people always dismantle the things they can't simply crush outright. Anonymous tips to city inspectors about code violations at my office. Mysterious delays in my grant approvals. Fines that seemed to appear from nowhere. I spent weeks fighting fires I couldn't trace back to any source, rallying my community, pushing back against what I assumed was corporate greed or city bureaucracy. I had no idea there was a specific man, sitting in a penthouse high above me, watching my struggle with an expression I still cannot fully decode. Was it satisfaction? Was it fascination? Maybe both. Because even as June sabotaged me, something about my refusal to break seemed to hold his attention in a way he hadn't expected and didn't want. Then his real problems arrived. The Italian-American Rossi family, a rival syndicate led by a sharp, calculating man named Marco Rossi, began moving on June's territory. Someone inside the Claw syndicate was feeding them information. A mole. And June, in a moment of reckless, paranoid fury during a high-stakes syndicate meeting, pointed his finger at me. He twisted my nonprofit's connections to at-risk youth, kids who had sometimes brushed up against the criminal world I was trying to pull them away from, into so-called evidence that I was working for the feds. It was a lie, a complete and deliberate lie. But in his world, the truth was whatever the most powerful person in the room decided it was. And just like that, I became his enemy. Not just the woman who scratched his car. His enemy. What happened next? I could not have imagined in my worst nightmare. It was raining the night they came for me. I remember the rain because it felt like the sky was trying to warn me about something I couldn't understand yet. I was walking to my car after a late night at the office, and then men in black suits materialized out of the dark, and before I could scream or run or do anything at all, I was inside a vehicle moving through the city, and then I was in an elevator, and then I was standing in the most breathtaking penthouse I had ever seen, overlooking Central Park like a king surveying his kingdom. And there he was, June, standing with his back to me, looking out at the city below, and when he turned around his eyes were cold and his voice was colder. "You scratched my world," he said. "Now you'll pay by becoming part of it." He produced a marriage contract. Forged. Legal-looking enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking closely. His syndicate was fracturing. Old school members were demanding he project stability, demanding he settle down. And marrying an outsider, specifically me, his so-called enemy, would send a message to everyone watching. June controlled everything. Even his enemies. Even the women who dared to scratch his car. I fought. I want you to know that. I fought with everything I had. I scratched his arm hard enough to draw blood. I screamed. I refused. But there were too many of his men, and my fight, as real and fierce as it was, wasn't enough against that kind of power. The wedding was a farce. A private chapel. His loyalists standing like sentinels around the walls. A terrified officiant who would not meet my eyes. I wore white because someone put me in it. I said vows because someone forced me to. And through every single word, my jaw was clenched and my heart was pounding with a rage, so pure it felt almost sacred. "I'll make your life hell," I promised him, right there at that altar. He looked at me with that unreadable face and said, "Welcome to mine." The first weeks inside his world were a kind of controlled war. His mansion was luxurious in the way that prisons designed by architects are luxurious, beautiful surfaces over something suffocating underneath. I had everything I could materially want and none of the things that actually mattered. Freedom. Purpose. My kids. My work. My life. But I am my mother's daughter and my father's daughter, and those two people did not survive what they survived so that I could sit down and accept a cage. So I started paying attention. I watched the movement of his men. I listened to conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. I began quietly, carefully, methodically building a picture of June's operations, telling myself that every piece of information I gathered was one step closer to the door. And then Hajia walked back into the picture. Hajia was June's ex-lover, a Korean socialite who had been discarded when June grew bored of her and who had been nursing a wound ever since that she had mistaken for a war injury. She returned from Seoul with a grudge she had polished until it gleamed, and the first thing she did was go after me. She leaked photos of me at June's side to the tabloids, framed carefully to make me look like a gold digger who had wormed her way into the mafia world for money and status. The headlines were ugly. The comments were uglier. And I felt the judgment of strangers pressing in on me from every direction, branding me with a story that had nothing to do with who I actually was. I should have been strategic. I should have let it go. But I am human, and I was exhausted. And when I saw Hajia at a high society gala looking pleased with herself across a crowded room, something in me moved before my better judgment could stop it. I walked over. I slapped her. In front of witnesses. In front of cameras. In front of everyone. It was a mistake. I know it was a mistake. But I am not going to pretend I didn't feel a complicated satisfaction in that moment, even as I watched it become ammunition in the hands of people who wanted to destroy both of us. Now, before I go any further, I have to stop and ask you something directly. You are watching this story right now, and it is free. It costs you nothing but a few minutes of your time. This channel, Korean Boss Stories, exists because of people who care enough to support it. If you have been watching and you have never subscribed, I need you to ask yourself why. Seriously, what is stopping you? Because if this story is holding your attention, if you are feeling something right now, then you already know this channel deserves your support. Hit that subscribe button. Or drop a comment and tell me honestly, why won't you subscribe? I genuinely want to know. The tragedy that changed everything came without warning, the way real tragedies always do. June, in a moment of impulsive, reckless fury over the Rossi threat, ordered a raid on one of their warehouses. He didn't wait for proper reconnaissance. He didn't plan carefully. He moved on instinct and anger, the way powerful people sometimes do when they feel their grip on things starting to slip. His men went in fast, and the Rossis were ready for them, and what followed was a bloodbath that none of us were prepared for. Minho was June's younger brother, the one person in the world that June had protected with everything he had, since they were children surviving together in a world that offered them very little mercy. Minho was caught in the crossfire, and he didn't make it out. I was not supposed to be there. I had slipped out of the mansion, against all rules, against all of June's ironclad security, because I was gathering evidence, building my case, planning my escape, but I was close enough to hear what happened, close enough to follow at a distance, close enough to be standing in the shadows when June's men brought Minho's body back. And what I saw in that moment, I have never fully been able to describe it, and I am not sure I ever will. You, June, the undisputed king of the Claw Syndicate, fell to his knees on a cold floor and held his brother's body and shook like a man who had been hollowed out. He whispered apologies in Korean, over and over, his voice cracking in ways I had not thought his voice capable of cracking. He looked like a boy, a broken, devastated boy who had lost the last thing that truly belonged to him. And something happened inside me that I had not given it permission to happen. I knew that grief. I knew the exact shape of it, the weight of it, the way it sits in your chest like something that cannot be removed. I had carried it since I was a teenager, standing over 2 caskets, promising my parents that their deaths would not be the end of their story. I had built a whole life out of the wreckage of that grief. And watching June carry his, in that raw and unguarded moment, I did something I still cannot entirely explain. I went to him. I sat beside him in the dark, this man who had kidnapped me and forced me into marriage and turned my life inside out, and I said quietly, "Pain like this doesn't define us. I know, because I've carried mine every single day and I am still here." He looked at me with those dark eyes, and for a moment all the coldness was gone, and there was just a human being underneath, and then the walls went back up and he pulled away. But the seed had been planted. I felt it. We both felt it. And neither of us knew what to do with that yet. The obsession that followed was uncomfortable and consuming and honestly, if I am being honest, frightening in ways that were sometimes hard to separate from other things I was starting to feel. June assigned me bodyguards, officially for my safety, practically because he wanted me close and monitored. He watched me with an intensity that felt different from the cold surveillance of the early days. There was something in it now that I recognized, something raw and possessive that went beyond strategy. There was a night, a stakeout that went completely wrong when a Rossi assassin cornered us in a parking structure, and I acted without thinking. I grabbed something from my bag, heavy, solid, and I disarmed the man before June's own security could respond. Training from years of working in dangerous neighborhoods, from learning to protect myself and my kids. The assassin was down, and June was standing there staring at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. He pressed his lips to my forehead. Just that. Barely a touch. But in the language of you, June, who touched no one gently, who showed nothing soft to anyone, it felt enormous. Thank you, he said. Like the words cost him something. And then everything complicated again, the way things do when you are trying not to feel what you are clearly already feeling. I had been making secret calls to Stephen, an old friend, a community leader from my neighborhood who had been one of the few people trying to track me down and make sure I was safe. June discovered the calls, and the rage that came over him was something I had not seen since those first days, raw and furious and deeply, obviously jealous. He destroyed my phone. He threw it against a wall in the kind of controlled explosion that somehow feels more frightening than pure chaos. You are mine now, he said, his voice low and shaking with something that might have been anger and might have been terror. Do you understand that? Mine. And I looked at him, this man I was supposed to hate, this man who had taken so much from me, and I felt something complicated and true stirring in me, and I hated it. I hated how real it felt. I hated that I was starting to see him. If you are still watching this story, and you are not subscribed to Korean Boss Stories yet, let me be direct with you. This channel puts out stories that stay with you. Stories that make you feel something. If you walked away right now and never came back, you would be leaving something real behind. So subscribe. Right now. While the feeling is fresh. Don't let this be the story you watched once and forgot. Let it be the one that made you stay. And then the truth about Hajia came out, and it rearranged everything. Hajia was not just a jealous ex-lover with a grudge. Hajia was the Rossi mole. She had been feeding Marco Rossi information from inside June's world for months. She had seduced Minho, sweet, trusting, young Minho, and used him as a source. And when Minho became a liability, she had made sure he was in that warehouse during that raid. She had not just betrayed June. She had helped engineer the death of his brother. When the full shape of what she had done became clear, something shifted in June that I think will never fully shift back. Regret does something to a person who has spent their entire life refusing to feel it. It gets in through the cracks and it doesn't leave. Hajia moved fast when she realized she had been exposed. She grabbed me before June could get to her. I found myself in an abandoned warehouse, bound, cold, sitting in the kind of darkness that makes you take stock of your whole life. I thought about my kids. I thought about second chance streets. I thought about my parents. And I thought, God help me, about June. He came alone. That was the stupid, human, reckless thing he did. He came alone, with no backup, no strategy, nothing but fury and fear driving him through those warehouse doors. He came for me, the way a man comes for someone when logic has been completely overruled by something deeper. The gunfire that followed was chaos. A bullet found him. I watched him go down and something in me broke open, and I was free of my restraints somehow. I don't even fully remember how. And I was beside him, pressing whatever fabric I could find against the wound, keeping him conscious, keeping him talking, keeping him here. Stay with me, I heard myself say. And I meant it in every way a person can mean something. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, as the world outside started to catch up to us, June looked at me with those dark eyes and said something I was not ready for. I hated you because you reminded me of what I lost. Trust. Hope. Everything I thought was gone forever. He paused, and the effort of speaking was visible on his face. But I cannot imagine a world without you in it, and that terrifies me more than anything I have ever faced. I was crying. I did not decide to cry. The tears just came. and I told him the truth in return. You forced me into this, I said. You took choices away from me that were not yours to take. And somehow, you have shown me a kind of strength I didn't know I still had. I don't know what to do with what I feel for you, but I feel it, and I am done pretending I don't. We held on to each other in that dark warehouse until the sirens got close enough to matter. The aftermath was swift. June exposed Hajia's role as the Rossi mole, the full scope of her betrayal, including what she had done to Minho. Her arrest sent a shockwave through both syndicates and dismantled the Rossi family's inside operation in one blow. Marco Rossi found himself suddenly blind to June's movements, and the counteroffensive that followed was decisive. But even in victory, June was quieter than I had ever seen him. Grief has a way of making victories feel hollow. He moved through the world differently now, still powerful, still commanding, but with a gravity to him that felt new. Like a man who had finally started counting the cost of everything. Hold on, right here. I need to ask you something. Because we are in the middle of a story together, and I want to know if you are fully here with me. Are you subscribed to this channel? If not, why not? Drop it in the comments. Seriously, tell me what is holding you back. Because stories like this one take real work to bring to you, and every subscription is a way of saying, I see that work. I value it. So if this story has moved you at all, subscribe. Do it right now before we get to the ending. Syndicate tradition demanded a wedding renewal, a formal, public ceremony to consolidate alliances after the Rossi takedown, to show that the Claw Syndicate was unified and unshakable. June could have made it another performance, another calculated display of power. Instead, he asked me what I wanted. That was new. That was so new it stopped me in the middle of a sentence. I told him I wanted my ments there. The kids from Second Chance Streets. The teenagers I had poured years of my life into. I wanted them standing in that room as a statement that my world and his world were not going to be kept separate anymore. That the line between them was going to be drawn differently from now on. He said yes. The ceremony took place in a grand ballroom, the kind of room that holds power in its architecture, in its height and its light and the weight of the air inside it. Around us stood Korean syndicate enforcers in sharp suits, their faces carefully neutral and their eyes watching everything. On my side stood community leaders, shelter workers, and a row of teenagers from Harlem who had dressed up in their best clothes and looked around that ballroom like they were trying to figure out if they were allowed to be there. They were allowed. I made sure of it. The whispers started the moment June and I walked to the altar together. I could hear them rippling through the crowd, forbidden, mismatched, impossible. Two worlds that had no business touching, standing at the center of a room and demanding to be seen. June took my hands, and for the first time in all the months I had known him, in all the confrontations and the violence and the grief and the impossible intimacy of surviving things together, his hands were trembling. You, June, king of the Claw Syndicate, was trembling. He looked at me like I was the most terrifying and the most necessary thing he had ever faced. And then he spoke his vows, and they were not the scripted words that an officiant had prepared. They were his own words, rough and imperfect and entirely true, and they cracked through that ballroom like something breaking open to let light in. When we kissed, the room went silent. Not the polite silence of ceremony, the stunned, breathless silence of witnesses to something they did not have a category for yet. His hands came to my face, and there was nothing in that moment except the two of us and everything we had survived to get there. Around us, I could hear gasps. I could feel the shock radiating from both sides of that room, his enforcers staring at their king's vulnerability, my people staring at my softening, at the woman they thought they knew choosing something complicated and true over something simple and safe. Cameras flashed. The image of us, a black woman from Harlem and a Korean Mafia king, standing in that ballroom with our lips together and our whole impossible story written on our faces, would travel fast. People would have opinions. People always have opinions about things they don't understand. But I was not kissing him for anyone in that room. I was kissing the man who had cracked open under grief in a cold warehouse and let me see what was underneath. The man who had, against all logic and all his own design, fallen harder than he ever imagined he could fall. The months that followed were not perfect. Nothing real ever is. June began quietly, methodically dismantling pieces of his criminal empire. It was not fast and it was not clean, and there were setbacks that cost him relationships, he had held for decades. But he moved toward it with the same determination he had brought to building it. And I think that is the thing about a person who is truly changing. They bring their whole self to it, including the parts that are hard and slow and unglamorous. He funded Second Chance Streets anonymously. I found out about it 6 weeks in, and I confronted him, and he looked at me with that carefully composed face and said, "Your work deserves to survive. I was in the way of it before. Now I am not." We went to therapy together. That was harder than the warehouse, honestly. Sitting across from a professional and trying to put language to what we had been through, his regret over Minho, my grief over the choices that had been taken from me, the complicated architecture of what we were building together. It required a vulnerability that neither of us came to easily. But we showed up. Every week. We showed up. And then I found out I was pregnant. I sat with that information for a whole afternoon before I told him. I sat with it, and I turned it over, and I felt it from every angle. A child. A new life, growing from 2 lives that had collided in the most violent and impossible way. Something that was, against all probability, entirely new. When I told June, he went very still. And then something happened in his face that I had only seen once before, when he held his brother's body. Except this time it was not grief. This time it was something I can only describe as wonder. Raw, unguarded, completely undefended wonder. He became, almost immediately, obsessively protective in the particular way that is both endearing and slightly overwhelming. He swore he would leave the mafia entirely for our family. He meant it. I believed him. And then the world, because it is the world, tested that promise immediately. A surviving heir from the Rossi family, younger than Marco, angrier, with nothing left to lose, came for us in a moment we thought we were finally safe. He came fast, and he came prepared, and there was no time for strategy or plans or anyone else stepping in. There was just the moment and the choice inside it. I shot him. I shot him to protect June, and to protect the child growing inside me, and to protect the future we had been building from the rubble of everything that brought us here. I dropped the gun immediately afterward, and I stood there shaking, feeling the weight of what I had done settling into my bones, the moral gravity of it, the complexity of it, the fact that protecting someone you love sometimes costs you a piece of your own peace. June held me through the shaking. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just held me. And that was the right thing. That was exactly the right thing. I want to stop here and ask you something. You, the person watching this right now. Does June deserve a second chance? Does he deserve forgiveness? He did genuinely terrible things. He kidnapped a woman. He forced her into marriage. He was driven by hatred born from a wound he never properly healed. And then, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, he changed. He tried. He showed up. If it were you, if you were in my position, trapped by someone who had hurt you and who was now, undeniably, transforming in front of you, what would you do? Could you separate the harm from the person? Could you stay? Would you? I genuinely want to know your answer. Drop it in the comments below. And while you were thinking about it, what did you make of the story overall? Was there a moment that surprised you? Did anything confuse you? Tell me in the comments. I read them. Every single one. We built a new life. It was slow and it was real, and it was built on foundations that had been tested by things most people never face. June moved fully into legitimate business, investments, community development, eventually partnering with organizations not entirely unlike Second Chance Streets, because redemption has a particular logic to it where you tend to invest in the thing you once tried to destroy. I expanded my work. More cities, more kids, more Second Chance Streets offices in more neighborhoods. The resources were there now in ways they had never been before, and I used every single one of them. Our child came into a world that was still complicated and imperfect, the way the world always is. But they came into a world where their parents had chosen to be honest about the damage they had caused and the work they had done to repair it. Where their father looked at their mother with something so fierce and complete it was almost difficult to witness. Where their mother looked at their father with clear eyes that had seen everything, the worst and the improbable best, and had chosen to stay. Before I close the story, I want to say something directly to you, because this is the kind of story that can sometimes make harmful things look romantic, and that is not a responsibility I am willing to walk away from. Forced marriage is not love. Kidnapping is not passion. Possessiveness is not protection. Coercive control disguised as obsession is abuse, legally, morally, in every dimension that matters. If you or someone you know is experiencing any form of coercion, control, or forced relationship, please reach out immediately. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available at 1-800-799-7233, or you can text START to 88788 for confidential support. Federal laws exist specifically to protect victims of forced marriage and trafficking. Organizations like the National Alliance on Mental Illness can help connect you to therapy and healing resources. True love does not imprison. It does not control. It does not take your choices away. Please protect yourself. Please reach out. You are worth more than the cage someone else built around you. This has been Korean Boss Stories. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. Subscribe if you haven't already. Like this video. Drop your thoughts in the comments, where you are watching from, what you thought of June, what you would have done in my place. And if there is a story you want told next, tell me. I will be here. I will always be here.